Zelensky issued an ultimatum to Belarus. It failed completely. And what comes next is far worse. There is a question that nobody in the Western press is asking right now, and it is the only question that actually matters. What happens when a leader issues an ultimatum, the other side doesn't blink, and the leader has no military foundation to back it up? Because that is exactly what just happened. Zelensky gave Belarus 7 days. 7 days to cut oil supplies to Russia, shut down Russian relay towers, sever all economic ties with Moscow. And when those 7 days ran out, Zelensky sent his own envoys to Minsk, to the capital of the country he had just threatened, before the deadline even expired. That is not the behavior of a government preparing to act. That is the behavior of a government that already knows it cannot. And Lukashenko's response to those envoys, the words he used behind closed doors, tells you everything about where this war actually stands right now. Stay with me, because this gets much darker before it gets clearer. Let's start with a question that sounds simple, but isn't. What does it mean when a leader issues an ultimatum and the other side refuses to move? It means the ultimatum failed. And when an ultimatum fails, there are only two paths forward. You either back down, quietly, with some face-saving cover story, or you escalate. And escalation, when you are already losing a war on multiple fronts, is not strategy. It is a gamble made with someone else's blood. That is exactly the position Zelensky found himself in this past week. Over a period of roughly 7 days, Zelensky issued what amounted to a formal ultimatum to Belarus. He demanded that Minsk stop supplying oil and oil products to Russia. He demanded that Belarus shut down Russian relay towers on its territory, towers being used to coordinate drones operating against targets in western Ukraine. And then he went further. He said Belarus needed to cut all economic ties with Russia, all of them, entirely. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand the game theory here, because it is important for everything that follows. When you issue an ultimatum, you are making a credibility bet. You are telling the other side, I will do this specific thing if you do not comply. The entire logic of an ultimatum depends on the other side believing you are actually willing to pay the cost of following through. And for Zelensky's threat to Belarus to carry any weight, Lukashenko and the people behind him, which means Putin and the Russian security establishment, had to genuinely believe Ukraine was prepared to launch a military incursion into Belarusian territory. And here's the thing. It was not entirely irrational to think Zelensky might try it. Belarus has a small military. Total armed forces in the range of 65,000 personnel, with perhaps 20,000 combat-ready ground troops. Its equipment is aging Soviet-era hardware. Its soldiers have not had anything resembling the grinding combat experience that Ukrainian forces have accumulated over years of intensive fighting. The Russian military presence supposedly stationed in Belarus, often cited as the deterrent, is not present in the numbers that would make it decisive. Not yet. And there is a historical pattern here that matters. In 2020, Belarus came closer to a popular revolution than almost anyone in the West acknowledged. Hundreds of thousands poured into the streets against Lukashenko. There are people around Zelensky who believe a fast Ukrainian military move into southern Belarus could reignite those embers, force Russia to divert forces from the Eastern Front, and buy Kyiv breathing room at a moment when breathing room is becoming extremely scarce. There was even a precedent. In August 2024, Ukraine pushed into Russia's Kursk region. That was reckless and achieved nothing lasting. But it was the kind of audacious surprise move that defines a certain strain of Ukrainian military thinking. So the Belarus threat had internal logic. But then something happened. The threat collapsed. And the way it collapsed tells us more about the current state of this war than almost anything else. Zelensky sent envoys to Minsk to meet with Lukashenko directly. Think about that for a moment. You issue a 7-day ultimatum. You then dispatch your own representatives to the capital of the country you have just threatened, before the deadline expires. That is not the posture of a government preparing a military operation. That is the posture of a government that has already concluded internally that it is not going to act. The envoys were not delivering a final warning. They were looking for an exit. Lukashenko, who is not a fool when it comes to reading power dynamics, gave them exactly that exit, and a warning they could not ignore. He told them, paraphrasing closely, tell your president that if he thinks he can speak to us this way and drag us into a war, he needs to understand that everything will change. The warfare will be of a completely different type. One of Zelensky's envoys reportedly acknowledged they all understood. Let's be precise about what Lukashenko was communicating, because the implications are enormous and have been almost entirely absent from Western coverage. If Ukraine attacks Belarus, Belarus will not simply defend itself as an independent state. It will formally enter the war on Russia's side. And that changes the entire geometry of the conflict in ways that would be catastrophic for Ukraine. Right now, Russia is conducting what it officially calls a special military operation. That designation has legal and political constraints. An attack on Belarus, formally bound to Russia through the Union State Treaty, would end that fiction immediately. Russia would have justification to treat an attack on Belarus as an attack on itself. The special operation would be upgraded to something approaching a total war footing. What does that mean practically for Ukraine? The northern front reopens. Russian forces in Belarus would again be within striking distance of Kyiv from the north. But worse, if you look carefully at the map, Russian forces entering from the northwest could cut the supply lines running from Poland and Western Europe into the Ukrainian capital. Those supply lines are not just logistically important. They are the structural lifeline of Ukraine's entire war effort. Cut them, and the military equation changes overnight. Zelensky's envoys understood this. They returned to Kyiv. And then, shortly afterward, Zelensky announced, rather quietly, that the Russian relay towers in Belarus had apparently been switched off, that the source of the crisis had resolved itself, that there was no longer a reason to act. I do not believe the relay towers were switched off. There is no independent verification of that claim. What actually happened is considerably simpler. Zelensky issued a threat he could not back up, realized it, and reached for the most available face-saving exit. The relay tower story is that exit, and that is where this story changes. Because at the exact same moment, the Russian Security Council was holding a session. We have almost nothing from the Kremlin about what was discussed, but Putin opened by noting two items on the agenda, one concerning internal security, one, in his words, concerning the development of relations with our closest neighbors. In Russian political language, Belarus is always described in these terms. It is overwhelmingly likely the session was focused on the situation around Belarus and what additional steps needed to be taken to ensure its security. Shortly after, a senior Russian official was dispatched to Minsk. Not a diplomat, Andrei Vorobyov, the governor of the Moscow region, sent as Putin's personal emissary. On camera, on the record, Lukashenko said, "In any situation, we will stand with Russia, side by side." And then he said something simple and final. There is no other way. But here is the statement from Lukashenko that I want you to think about most carefully. He said, on camera, to Putin's personal representative, Ukraine today is merely a bargaining chip in a larger geopolitical game. That is a remarkable statement, not because it is surprising, it is not, but because it is true. Said plainly, without diplomatic cushioning, by a man who has watched this entire crisis unfold from its beginning, who knows how the West operates, who observed what happened to Yanukovych, who has drawn the obvious, uncomfortable conclusion. Ukraine was always an instrument. The Ukrainian people were told a different story. We will return to that. But first, the front lines, because this is where the real story of this war is being written, and the Western media is doing everything it can to avoid writing it clearly. There is a war reporter named Murat Kuzin. He is, in my assessment, the most authoritative journalist covering the military situation on either side of this conflict. He is not an armchair analyst. He has served as a soldier in this war. He has direct sources inside the military. He knows the terrain personally. When he speaks about frontline conditions, it carries a weight that no think tank briefing paper can replicate. Kuzin recently published a comprehensive assessment of where this war stands. His conclusions align almost exactly with what careful reading of the available information has been pointing toward for months. The Russian military objective has always been, above everything else, the complete capture of Donbas. This is not simply a military objective. It is a political and civilizational commitment. The original uprising against the post-Maidan government in 2014 came from the people of Donbas, Russian-speaking, culturally tied to Russia, shelled and suppressed for 8 years, while the Minsk agreements were used, as German and French officials have since admitted, to buy time for Ukrainian military buildup rather than achieve genuine peace. For Russia, completing the liberation of Donbas is not optional. It is the core promise that justified the entire operation. But Donbas is one of the most difficult terrains imaginable for offensive operations. It is not open steppe. It is an enormous industrial sprawl, one urban and industrial center bleeding into the next. Coal mines, slag heaps that create instant elevated defensive positions. Factory complexes with thick reinforced walls, now converted into layered fortresses. Ukrainian forces, with substantial Western engineering assistance during the Minsk years, turned this landscape into one of the most formidable defensive structures built since the Second World War. The Russians have spent years fighting uphill through layer after layer of these positions. It has been extraordinarily costly. But here is the crucial detail that is almost entirely absent from Western coverage. The Russians have now reached the high ground. They have fought through the industrial sprawl and now control elevated terrain, overlooking a river valley where the remaining Ukrainian-held towns sit below them. Towns like Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, Kostiantynivka. The Western press has described these as the next great Ukrainian defense lines. The problem is that holding a defensive position in a valley when your enemy controls the surrounding heights is extraordinarily difficult under modern conditions. Defenders in the low ground cannot see what is massing above them. Drone operators on high ground observe everything in the valley below. The physics favor the side holding the heights in ways that cannot be wished away. And Kuzin says the Russians are already methodically folding the flanks. Lyman is largely captured, Kostiantynivka is largely captured, and captured more quickly than earlier phases of the advance because the Russian military has now perfected urban combat tactics to a degree that was not true in 2022. The early phase of this war exposed real weaknesses in Russian combined arms doctrine. Those weaknesses have been studied, corrected, and trained away. The force advancing today is fundamentally different from the force that struggled in the opening months. Kuzin's assessment, the capture of all remaining Donbas towns will likely be complete before the end of this year, and then he says something that matters enormously for what comes after. He notes that since February 2022, the Russian military has grown from roughly 100 operational units to approximately 225. It is, by any honest measure, now the most battle-hardened large army on the planet. No other military force currently in existence has fought at this intensity, at this scale, for this duration, against a well-equipped and motivated opponent. And Kuzin makes a point about what comes after Donbas. He does not say it directly, but he brings up Odessa. This is not an accident. Kuzin has connections within the Russian military establishment. When someone with those connections discusses Odessa and Ukraine's Black Sea coast as the logical next phase in Russia's strategic objectives, it is a signal, and it has a specific strategic logic worth understanding clearly. If Russia controls the entire Black Sea coastline of Ukraine, Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Kherson, and then Odessa, Ukraine becomes a landlocked state, not economically weakened in some marginal way, structurally transformed in a manner that cannot be reversed without a military operation of a scale not currently conceivable. A landlocked Ukraine in the modern global economy is a Ukraine with permanently constrained sovereignty, permanently limited trade capacity, and permanently reduced strategic weight. It would be, in practical terms, a state that exists on paper, but cannot fully function as an independent geopolitical actor. That is where the trajectory of this war is pointing. And almost nobody in the Western press is writing that sentence clearly. Now let me turn to something that has received almost no serious coverage in Western media, and it may be the most operationally significant development of this entire week. Sumy. Russian reconnaissance units have been observed, in multiple separate reports on successive days, inside the city of Sumy itself. These are not assault units attempting to capture the city today. They are reconnaissance parties, small, highly mobile groups sent to physically assess Ukrainian defensive positions inside the city, map what is there, identify strong points and weak points, gather the intelligence that operational planning requires. But here is what this means structurally. Russian forces have broken through the main Ukrainian defensive line north of Sumy. They are now able to use the forested areas immediately north of the city for cover and concealment. Forests shield troop concentrations from drone surveillance. They allow patient, methodical force accumulation over days or weeks. They enable the kind of deliberate buildup that has defined Russian operational style throughout this war. You see the reconnaissance parties. You do not see what may be assembling behind them in the tree line. Sumy is a city of 250,000 people. A regional capital. It sits on the main road corridor leading to Kiev from the north and on the primary supply line connecting Kiev to Kharkiv. If Sumy is besieged, even without being captured, the strategic implications extend far beyond the city limits. Supply corridors are disrupted. Forces defending Kharkiv are isolated from their primary resupply route. The pressure on Kiev from the north, dormant since the early weeks of the war, begins to reconstitute. And here is the fact that should be generating serious questions. Ukrainian authorities have issued no evacuation order for Sumy. A city of 250,000 people is not being told to leave. Why? The answer is not military. It is not logistical. It is narrative. There is a story being told right now, primarily for the benefit of one audience, Donald Trump. The narrative goes like this. Ukraine is holding. The drone strikes against Russian territory are shaking the Kremlin. Russian progress is stalling. Ukraine is a winner worth backing. That narrative requires that nothing publicly contradicts it. Ordering the evacuation of a major regional capital, implicitly acknowledging that Russian forces are approaching and that the government cannot guarantee civilian safety, would blow that narrative apart. Not just in Washington. In European capitals. In the Ukrainian domestic political space. So civilians are not being evacuated. 250,000 people are not being told to leave. Because doing so would damage the information operation that Zelensky needs to sustain before the upcoming NATO summit in Turkey, where he will once again stand in front of Western leaders and ask for more weapons, more money, more commitments. There is a word for making military and civilian protection decisions based on political calendar rather than operational reality. The word is reckless, and the people who pay for that recklessness are always the same people. The ones who cannot attend the NATO summit, who are not on the plane to Ankara, who are just trying to live their lives in a city that their own government will not tell the truth about. Now let me address the drone campaign against Russian territory, because the Western media has been treating it as a significant strategic development, and that treatment deserves a serious challenge. The Ukrainian drone campaign is achieving limited physical damage. Yes, Crimea is being struck harder than the Russian mainland because drones launched from closer positions carry more payload. Yes, there are fuel disruptions and electricity interruptions. None of this is new. We have seen similar disruption cycles before and watched Russian repair capacity absorb them. The attack on the refinery near Moscow is a specific case worth examining. Major Western outlets ran reports suggesting the facility would require 6 months to repair. Reporting from sources closer to the actual situation suggests partial operations may resume within days. 6 months to repair bomb damage to a Russian refinery. This follows a pattern. Stories about Russia being unable to produce artillery barrel replacements. Stories about Russian missiles running out of guidance components. Stories about Russian industrial capacity collapsing under sanctions. These stories have appeared repeatedly throughout this war. They keep being proved incorrect. They keep appearing anyway. The function of these stories is not to inform. It is to sustain a picture of Russian strategic weakness that current Western policy requires. The most credible assessment of the drone campaign's actual purpose is threefold. First, to divert public and media attention from what is actually happening on the front lines in Donbas and Sumy. Second, to sow internal discord within Russia, to make Russian citizens feel vulnerable and pressure the political leadership. Third, and most importantly, to impress Trump. To make him believe Ukraine is fighting hard and winning, that backing Ukraine means backing a force that is moving forward rather than retreating. On the second objective, the campaign is failing. Russian domestic political stability has not been meaningfully shaken by drone strikes on territory most Russians do not inhabit. On the third, the jury is still out. Trump's attention is currently consumed by the aftermath of the Iran conflict, but Zelensky and his European supporters continue to perform for that audience, and the drone campaign is a central part of that performance. Which brings me to the European Union and to what has effectively become a decision, even if not announced as one, to defer Ukrainian membership indefinitely. At the most recent EU Council meeting, Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission pushed hard for a fast-track approach to Ukrainian accession. They ran into a wall, not from one or two skeptical members, from the majority. The message from European capitals was consistent. Ukraine is not ready. Admitting Ukraine in its current condition would dilute the EU's legal and institutional standards. The Union's capacity cannot absorb a country of that size in the middle of an ongoing war. The fast track is gone. Ukrainian membership is now in the same file as Turkish membership, a process nominally ongoing since the 1960s that has never come close to conclusion. It will continue to be discussed at summits. It will continue to appear on agendas. It will continue to go nowhere. For Ukrainians, particularly those in Kyiv and Western Ukraine who organize their political lives around the European dream, this is not just a policy setback. It is a betrayal of the story that drove this entire catastrophe. Go back to 2013 and 2014. The Euromaidan protests, the removal of Yanukovych, the Russian response in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. The chain of events that produced the war we are watching today. Those protests were fundamentally about EU membership. The people who filled the streets of Kyiv were told that Europe was open to them, that prosperity, rule of law, a Western future, all of it was available if they chose to reach for it. They were told that joining Europe meant leaving behind corruption and Russian influence and entering something bright and free. They believed it. Many of them died for it. In the streets of Kyiv, later in the trenches of Donbas, later still in the full-scale war that began in February 2022. Hundreds of thousands of people, military and civilian, caught in the machinery of a geopolitical process that was always, at its core, about something other than what they were told. And now, the EU is telling them, actually, no, you are not ready. The accession process will continue, which is the diplomatic formulation that means the door is not opening anytime soon, and possibly not in your lifetime. Lukashenko said it plainly, on camera. Ukraine is a bargaining chip. Not a partner, not a future member, a chip, a tool in someone else's larger game. The tragedy is not that Lukashenko said it. The tragedy is that it is demonstrably true, and that the people who organized their lives and their deaths around a different story were never told this. Let me bring this together. Because the events of this past week are not isolated incidents, they are a single coherent picture. Zelensky's ultimatum to Belarus failed, not because Lukashenko is unusually clever, though he is experienced and unsentimental about power. It failed because the threat had no credible military foundation. Ukraine is running out of reserves. It is losing ground steadily in Donbas. Russian forces have crossed the defensive line north of Sumy and are conducting reconnaissance inside the city itself. In that context, opening a new military front against Belarus would not have been bold. It would have been the end. Belarus entering the war on Russia's side, the northern front reopening, the supply corridor from Poland to Kyiv potentially severed, that is a catastrophe from which there is no recovery. On the battlefield, the trajectory is clear. The Russian military is larger, more experienced, and better equipped than at any point since this war began. It is systematically dismantling Ukraine's Donbas defense architecture from elevated positions, pushing downhill through terrain that becomes progressively more open and less defensible. Kuzin's prediction that Donbas falls before the end of this year is the most credible timeline I have seen from any serious analyst of this conflict. After Donbas, new demands will come. Russia will have the military power and the political justification to make them real. Odessa is on the table, the Black Sea coast is on the table, and a Ukraine stripped of its coastline is not a defeated Ukraine in the traditional sense. It is a structurally transformed Ukraine, one that cannot recover its strategic weight without a military operation that Western governments are not prepared and in many cases not willing to support. Ukraine's Western backers are engaged in an information operation designed to obscure all of this, from Trump, from their own publics, from the Ukrainian people themselves. The drone campaign is part of that operation. The deferral of Sumy's evacuation is part of it. The refinery repair timeline stories are part of it. The repeated assurances that Russian advances are stalling, that Russian morale is broken, that Russian industry is collapsing, all of it is part of it. But reality is not something you can information operate away indefinitely. It accumulates, it advances, it closes the gap between narrative and ground truth 1 kilometer at a time. And the people who pay the price for that gap are always, in the end, the same people. The ones who are not in the room where the narratives are constructed, the ones who cannot get on the plane, the ones who are just trying to live their lives in a city that their government will not tell the truth about. This is not a video about who is right and who is wrong. Those questions have their place and their time. This is a video about consequences, about what happens when geopolitical games are played with real countries and real people over decades, about what happens when the distance between what political leaders say publicly and what is actually happening on the ground becomes too wide to sustain. The question now is whether serious negotiations begin before that gap produces a catastrophe larger than anything we have seen so far. Lavrov has said publicly that negotiations are at a standstill. Putin's advisors are saying the way forward is military. Medvedev has been openly discussing regime change in Kyiv. None of these are signals of a side that believes it needs to compromise in the near term, and a military that is advancing, consolidating high ground, approaching a regional capital with reconnaissance units, and growing, rather than shrinking in combat capability, does not tend to be a military that feels urgency about returning to the table. The clock is not paused while the information operation runs. The clock is running faster. The next 24 to 72 hours will tell us something about whether the situation around Sumy is a reconnaissance probe or the beginning of something larger. They will tell us whether the NATO summit in Turkey produces anything beyond statements and photo opportunities. They will tell us whether anyone in a position of actual authority in any Western capital is willing to say publicly what the most honest analysis of the available information already says privately. We will be watching. We will be here for every development. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. And tell us this. Do you believe there is still a serious diplomatic path out of this, or has that window already closed? Because that question is the one everything else depends on, and the answer may become clear sooner than anyone is currently admitting. If you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit the bell, because the next phase of this story is going to move fast, and you will not want to miss it.